Welcome to Words of Light for Today, a teaching ministry that shares godly principles while giving spiritual insight and divine revelation from the Word of God for the everydayness life brings. Be richly blessed as we join Linda Adkins.
They were witnesses at the raising of Lazarus from the dead. But when Lazarus come to the door of the tomb, he was still bound up. When they get to the tomb where Jesus had been laid, the strips were left there. The strips of cloth and the cloth that was left on his face, the same as Lazarus. Lazarus had a grave cloth over his face, and he was all bound up. But when they get to the tomb of Jesus, they find that that cloth had been folded and laid aside. And the strips were just as they were. The power that Jesus raised Lazarus with brought him to the entrance of the tomb, but it was still all rolled up in the grave clothes that he had. And the Jews buried everybody the same way. They rolled them in strips of cloth, their arms, their legs, their body. They buried everybody the same, and they put a grave cloth over their face. They used all kinds of spices and things. But when you get to the tomb of Jesus, you see that his cloths were still there, laying on the tomb. He came right up through those grave clothes. The power that God raised Jesus from the dead was different in the fact that Jesus raised Lazarus. The grave clothes had to be taken off of Lazarus. But when God raised Jesus, he brought him, he so resurrected him that he brought him right up through all of those claws and strips of cloth that he was bound in. And they just lay right where they were. His arm strips, his body strips, the leg strips, everything was just left right there, and he came right up through it. Now, the power that Jesus raised Lazarus with was a power that was from God, but it was not the power that God was going to raise Jesus. Because the power that he used to raise Jesus was a power that death was never again going to have any power over any human on this planet ever again. Never. So, the power that God used to raise Jesus brought him right up through all the cloth, through everything, and set him up in that tomb. And that power was so strong that it rolled that tomb back, that stone back. Now Jesus, being Jesus, came right up through the cloth that they had on his face, but he took it and folded it. Order. Order to this thing. Order to this death. All of the cloth strips that was wrapped around him, there was order to them. They were just left right where they were. And he came up through them. How powerful is that? Now, the power that Jesus raised Lazarus with was a power that was strong enough to raise a man dead 4 days, which proved he was Messiah. Most any prophet that had ever raised anybody from the dead, they were dead just 3 days. So the Jews had it in their writings that if Messiah came, and when he did come, they said in their writings, that he would have to be able to raise a man that was dead 4 days, which they knew there was no life after the 4th day. So, here's the thing. The power that Jesus used to raise Lazarus has never been used again. The power that God used to raise Jesus is used over and over and over and over and over and over every time someone gets born again. It is the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, brings you right up through all of that sin, all of that stuff in your life, brings you right up and sits you upright on your feet so you can walk in newness of life. Glory to God. Brings you right up through all of that pertains to you. When Jesus died, he drank that cup of sin. But God promised him, if you will take on the sins of the world and die for their sin, I will not leave you to be dead, but I will raise you again to life. And sin then will no longer have power. If you choose not to sin, you don't have to sin. If you choose to walk before God in a holy way, in a moral way, you don't ever have to be worried that sin just took you down and choked you and made you do it. Because once you make up your mind, this is the way I'm going, then there is no power in sin to stop you. The power that Jesus used to raise Lazarus from the dead has never been used since. The power that Jesus used still required human help, because Jesus turned and said to them, loose him and let him go. That meant take your knife and cut off those grave clothes. He did not come up through his grave clothes. His cloth was not left folded where he had laid. His cloth was still on him. His head was still covered by that grave cloth. Those things were still on him. All he could do was hop to the entrance of that tomb. All he could do. So the power that Jesus raised Lazarus with was never used again. Because when the real resurrection came, that power caused the dead to come up through the grave clothes. When you are called, when the last trump of God is sounded, and you are called out of your grave, if you are dead when he comes, if you are dead when that trump sounds, you're going to come right up through that dirt, right up through that old rotted casket, right up through all those clothes that they put on you. And you're going to meet him in the air.